The old library smelled like rain and forgotten things. Not the clean smell of rain on fresh grass, but the heavy smell of rain seeping through ancient stone walls, mixing with the dust of 1,000 decaying books. Cale watched the woman across the table and tried to read her the way he read battlefields. Her name was Alara. She was 26 years old, the youngest archivist the Southern Territories had ever appointed, and right now her fingers were tracing the edge of the treaty document like it might bite her. They were alone in the Neutral Territories' last standing library, a building that had survived 3 wars mostly because neither side could agree on who should burn it down first. The date was October 14th. The ceasefire was supposed to begin at midnight. On the table between them lay the final logistical pages of the treaty, 73 pages of border patrol schedules, resource allocation charts, and prisoner exchange timelines. Cale had read every word 3 times. He still didn't trust any of it. The quill sat in a brass holder between them. It was carved from the wing bone of a dusk crane, a bird that had been extinct for almost a century. The Southerners had found a box of them in some archive and insisted on using them for all official documents. Tradition, they said. Cale thought it was ridiculous. A bird that couldn't even exist anymore signing a piece that probably wouldn't exist either. He signed his name first. Cale Mason, Northern Enforcer, Border Division. The letters came out sharp and clean. He'd learned to write in a military camp at age 7, using charcoal on flat stones. His hand didn't tremble. It never did. Across from him, Alara reached for the quill. He noticed the hesitation immediately. Her fingers stopped an inch from the bone shaft. Her eyes flicked toward the tall window behind him, the one that faced east toward the river. Just for a second. Then back to the quill. Cale didn't turn around. He kept his face neutral, but his muscles tensed beneath his coat. He'd learned long ago that small movements meant big things. A horse flicking its ear before a snake struck. A soldier adjusting his grip a moment before drawing a blade. A woman looking at a window when she should be looking at a treaty. Alara's hand was still trembling. Not badly. Just enough that he could see it from 3 feet away. "Cold in here," she said quietly. It wasn't cold. The library had ancient heating pipes that clanked and groaned, but kept the main reading room almost warm. Cale could feel sweat on his own back from the heavy wool coat he hadn't bothered to remove. He said nothing, just watched her fingers close around the bone quill. The scratching sound filled the room as she dipped the tip in ink. Her name, Alara Vance. She wrote it slowly, carefully, like she wanted each letter to matter. The ink was thick and dark, made from crushed river stones according to some old recipe the archivists refused to abandon. Cale's eyes stayed on her face, the slight furrow between her eyebrows, the way she bit her bottom lip, the quick glance toward the window again as she finished the last letter. Something was wrong. He opened his mouth to speak. The window exploded. Not cracked, not shattered. Exploded inward like something had hit it at full speed. Glass sprayed across the table. Cale threw his arm up instinctively, felt tiny shards bite into his skin. The treaty pages lifted and scattered like frightened birds. And then a body hit the table. A man, mid-30s, dark hair, wearing the rough-spun clothes of a river trader. He landed face down across the scattered pages, his arms splayed wide, one hand still reaching toward something beneath his coat. Blood spread across the vellum beneath his chest, slow and dark, turning the border maps into something horrible and new. Alara made a sound. Not a scream. Something smaller and worse. A choked gasp that caught in her throat and died there. Cale was already moving. His body placed itself between her and the broken window before his brain finished processing what had happened. Old habits. Protect the principle. Sort out the details later. Above them, boots pounded on wooden floors. Second story. Moving fast. Multiple sets. The man on the table made a wet sound. Still alive. His fingers twitched toward his belt, where Cale could see the handle of a small blade tucked into the fabric. Not a weapon for fighting. A weapon for close work. Quiet work. Alara's hand grabbed Cale's arm. Her grip was surprisingly strong, fingernails digging into his skin through his coat. He looked down at her. Her face had gone pale, but her eyes were sharp, tracking from the dying man to the window to the stairs at the far end of the room. She knew him. She knew the dying man. Cale filed that information away for later. If there was a later. The boots were closer now, coming down the main staircase. 3, maybe 4 people. Moving with purpose, not panic. "Come on," Cale said. His voice came out calm. He'd learned that trick too. Sound calm and people followed. Sound scared and people froze. Alara didn't move. Her eyes stayed on the man's twitching fingers. On the blade he couldn't reach. Cale grabbed her wrist and pulled. Hard. She stumbled away from the table just as the man's hand went still. But instead of following toward the hidden passage behind the giant atlas stand, Alara wrenched free and lunged back toward the table. Cale cursed under his breath and reached for her again. She grabbed one page. Just one. A single sheet of vellum covered in border territory markings, now smeared with blood at one corner. She stuffed it into her shirt against her skin and turned back to him. Their eyes met. Hers were wet but steady. His were cold and calculating. The boots hit the bottom of the stairs. Cale grabbed her wrist again and pulled her toward the atlas stand. This time she came. He pressed against the heavy oak frame, found the hidden latch by feel. He'd mapped every escape route in this building 2 days ago, because that's what you did when you didn't trust a treaty, and pushed. The wall swung open. Darkness beyond. The smell of old stone and mouse droppings. Behind them, voices. Men shouting. The sound of furniture overturning. Cale pushed Alara through first, then stepped in after her. He pulled the hidden door closed just as footsteps entered the main reading room. For a long moment, they stood in complete darkness, breathing hard. Alara's hand found his in the black. She squeezed once, hard. He didn't squeeze back, but he didn't pull away either. Above them, through the stone, muffled voices. Someone shouting orders. Someone else shouting back. Alara's breath was warm against his neck. He could feel her shaking. Who was he? Cale whispered. A long pause. Then, so quiet he almost missed it. My brother. The words hung in the darkness between them. Cale thought about the blood on the treaty. The page she'd saved. The look on her face when the glass exploded. He'd come here to sign a peace treaty he didn't believe in. Instead, he was standing in a secret passage with a woman whose brother had just died on the very document that was supposed to end the fighting. Outside, the shouting continued. Inside, only the sound of 2 people breathing in the dark, bound together by a treaty neither of them could trust. The darkness pressed against them like a living thing. Cale stood perfectly still, listening. Through the stone wall, he could hear the men moving through the reading room. Furniture scraping across floorboards. Someone kicking over a chair. Voices bouncing off the high ceiling. Check the windows. Already did. Nothing. The passage. There has to be a passage. Cale felt Alara's hand tighten around his. Her palm was damp with sweat. In the complete darkness, he couldn't see her face, but he could hear her breathing. Shallow. Too fast. The kind of breathing that came right before panic set in. He squeezed her hand once. A warning. Be quiet. She understood. Her breathing slowed, just a little. The hidden door they'd come through was old oak, fitted into the stone so perfectly that you'd never notice it unless you knew exactly what to look for. Cale had found it 2 days ago during his security sweep. The librarian who'd shown him was old and nervous and wanted the northern enforcer to know that this building held no secrets. Really, none at all. Please don't burn it down. Cale had smiled and nodded and memorized every detail. Now that same door was the only thing between them and the men with boots. Alara shifted beside him. Her shoulder brushed against his chest. She was smaller than he'd realized. Most archivists he'd met were old men with round bellies and spectacles, but Alara was young and slight, and right now she was trembling so hard he could feel it through both their coats. He hated that he noticed. A beam of light cut through the darkness. Not through the door, through a small crack in the stone to their left. Cale turned his head slowly and saw it. A narrow gap between 2 limestone blocks, maybe 2 fingers wide, letting in a sliver of light from somewhere outside. The passage wasn't completely sealed. Good to know. He leaned closer to the gap and peered through. They were above the main reading room now, looking down through some old architectural quirk, a ventilation shaft, or maybe a spot where the wall had settled over centuries. Below, he could see 3 men in dark coats moving through the library. One of them held a lantern high, casting long shadows across the scattered treaty pages on the floor. The body was gone. Cale blinked, looked again. The table where Alara's brother had fallen was empty. No blood. No body. Nothing. They'd moved fast. Professionally fast. The man with the lantern stopped directly below them. He was tall, clean-shaven, with a scar running from his left eyebrow down to his jaw. Military, Cale thought. Northern military, based on the cut of his coat. That didn't make sense. Cale was Northern. He knew every officer assigned to the treaty signing. He'd never seen this man before. The scarred man tilted his head, listening. For a horrible moment, Cale thought he'd heard something. Their breathing, their heartbeat, something. But then the man shook his head and gestured to the others. Clear the floor. They went out the window. Must have had a boat on the river. The other two nodded and headed toward the broken window. Cale didn't believe it. Neither did the scarred man, apparently, because he stayed where he was, turning slowly in a circle, his eyes scanning every corner of the room. Then he looked up, straight at the ventilation gap, straight at Cale. Their eyes didn't meet. The gap was too small, the angle wrong, but for one terrible second, Cale felt seen. He stopped breathing entirely. Beside him, Alara must have sensed something because she went completely still. The scarred man stared at the ceiling for a long moment. Then he smiled. Just a small smile, the kind you give when you know something someone else doesn't. He walked away. His boots echoed on the wooden floor, then faded. Cale waited, counted to 60 in his head, then 30 more. Nothing. He let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Beside him, Alara did the same. "We need to move," he whispered. "Now." She didn't argue, didn't ask questions, just nodded in the darkness. Cale reached out and found the wall with his palm. The passage went 2 directions, left, deeper into the library, and right, toward the river side of the building. He'd mapped both in his head. Left led to more passages, more hiding spots, but also more chance of getting trapped. Right led to a service hatch that opened onto the riverbank, 50 feet from the water's edge. He chose right. They moved slowly at first, one hand on the wall, feet feeling for obstacles in the dark. The passage narrowed. Cale's shoulders brushed both sides. Behind him, Alara stumbled once, caught herself on his coat, kept moving. The air changed. Fresher, cooler, moving air, not stagnant. The passage ended at a wooden hatch, old and warped, held closed by a single iron latch. Pale light seeped around the edges. Late afternoon light, not lantern light. Cale pressed his ear to the wood. Listened. Heard water lapping against stone. Heard birds. No voices. No boots. He lifted the latch slowly, silently, and pushed. The hatch opened onto the riverbank. Cold air hit his face, carrying the smell of wet stone and dead leaves. The river moved past, gray and slow under the October sky. No boats in sight. No men on the bank. Cale climbed out first, then reached back for Alara. She took his hand and let him pull her through. She landed beside him, breathing hard, and for a moment they just stood there, exposed on the riverbank, waiting for someone to shout. No one did. Alara looked back at the library. Her face was pale, her dark hair escaping from its pins, a small cut on her cheek from flying glass that she hadn't even noticed. She looked young and lost, and completely out of her depth. Then she looked at Cale. "Where did you learn about that passage?" Her voice was quiet, not accusing, just asking. Cale hesitated. He could lie, say he'd noticed it during a walkthrough, paid attention, done his job. It was even mostly true, but something in her eyes made him tell the full truth. "I mapped this building 2 days ago. Every exit, every hiding spot, every place a person could go if things went wrong. Why? Because I didn't trust the treaty. And I didn't trust your people. She nodded slowly. Accepted that. Then she reached into her shirt and pulled out the page she'd grabbed from the table. The border map, still smeared with her brother's blood at one corner. I didn't trust it either, she said. That's why he was there. My brother. He was supposed to warn me if something went wrong. Kale looked at the blood on the paper, then at her face, then back at the library, where men with scarred faces were probably still searching. What went wrong? Alara's voice cracked, just a little. I don't know, but they took his body. They didn't have to take his body unless they didn't want us to find something. Kale thought about the scarred man's smile, about the way he'd looked at the ceiling, about how easily he'd let them escape. They knew, Kale said slowly. They knew about the passage. They wanted us to run. Alara stared at him. Why would they want that? Kale didn't have an answer, but he had a bad feeling growing in his stomach, the kind he'd learned to trust over 15 years of military service. The sun was setting over the river, painting the water orange and gold. In 3 hours, the ceasefire was supposed to begin. Instead, they were standing on a riverbank with a dead man's blood on a treaty page. No idea who to trust and nowhere safe to go. Alara folded the map carefully and put it back in her shirt. What now? She asked. Kale looked at her, at the cut on her cheek, at the steadiness in her eyes despite everything. Now we find out who wanted us alive. He started walking upstream, toward the old limestone ice houses carved into the riverbank. They'd need shelter before dark. They'd need answers before morning. Behind him, Alara followed without question. And as they walked, Kale realized something that bothered him more than any of it. For the first time in years, he wasn't walking alone. And he didn't completely hate it. The ice house smelled of salt and time. 3 days they'd been hiding here. 3 days in a limestone cave carved into the riverbank a mile upstream from the library. 3 days of listening to water drip somewhere in the darkness, of feeling the cold seep up through packed snow on the floor, of watching the thin sliver of light under the heavy wooden door change from bright to dim to gone, and then back again. Kale sat with his back against the curved stone wall, knees drawn up, watching Alara sleep. She'd finally stopped shivering about an hour ago. That worried him more than the shivering had. Shivering meant your body was still fighting, still trying. The silence meant it was giving up. They'd found this place by accident. An old storage cellar used by fishermen decades ago, long abandoned, half buried in the riverbank. The door was heavy oak, reinforced with iron bands, and when they'd pulled it shut behind them on that first night, the darkness had been so complete that Kale had pressed his hand to his face and seen nothing. No one had come looking. That worried him too. Alara stirred in her sleep, made a small sound, almost a whimper. Her hand reached out, searching for something, and Kale found himself reaching back before he could stop himself. Their fingers touched. She calmed immediately, her breathing evening out, her hand going slack. He left his hand there, told himself it was practical. She'd sleep better. They both needed her to sleep better. Outside, through the door, he heard footsteps. Kale's body went rigid. His hand tightened on Alara's, and she woke instantly, the way people wake when they've learned to be afraid. Her eyes found his in the darkness. He pressed a finger to his lips. The footsteps stopped directly outside the door. Silence. Long enough that Kale started counting heartbeats. 12, 20, 30. A voice, low and casual. Nothing down here. Just old storage. Another voice, farther away. Check it anyway. The door creaked as someone pushed against it. Held firm. The ice house had been built to store blocks of ice cut from the river in winter, packed in straw, kept cold until summer. The doors were meant to keep people out as much as keep cold in. Another push. Harder this time. Kale's free hand moved slowly to the knife at his belt. It was small, not much use in a real fight, but better than nothing. Beside him, Alara had gone completely still. He could feel her pulse racing through their joined hands. Locked or stuck? The distant voice called. Stuck, I think. Too much snow against it. Forget it. They're long gone by now. The footsteps moved away, crunching on frozen ground, then fading into silence. Kale counted to 200 before he breathed again. Beside him, Alara let out a long, shaky exhale. She pulled her hand away from his and hugged her knees to her chest. "How long?" she whispered. "3 days." "No. How long until we can leave?" Cale shook his head in the darkness. "I don't know." They'd had no food since the first night, when Cale had found half a dozen shriveled potatoes left in a wooden crate from some long-ago harvest. They'd eaten them raw, 2 each, and saved the last 2 for emergencies. That was yesterday morning. The last potatoes were still in his pocket, but they both knew food wasn't their biggest problem. Water was easier. Melted snow from a crack in the limestone where the cold air crept in. They'd cupped it in their hands and drunk until their teeth ached. But 3 days in the dark does things to a person. Cale had been trained for this. Survive. Wait. Observe. He'd spent weeks in worse conditions during his military service. But Alara wasn't military. She was an archivist, a woman who spent her days surrounded by books and light and other people. And yet she hadn't complained once. Not when the cold woke her shivering in the night. Not when hunger cramped her stomach. Not when the footsteps came close and she had to press her hand over her own mouth to stay silent. Cale found himself watching her more than he watched the door. On the 3rd day, or what he thought was the 3rd day, time moved strangely in the dark. Alara spoke. "My brother's name was Tomas." Cale didn't respond, just waited. He was 29, 2 years older than me. He joined the Southern Border Patrol when he was 18, and I thought he was crazy. I thought he'd die in the first winter. Her voice was flat, matter of fact, like she was reading from one of her books. He didn't die. He got promoted, made sergeant, started sending me letters about all the small things that made the border beautiful. The way the light hit the river at dawn. The family of foxes that lived near his watch post. The old woman who sold hot bread from a cart and always gave him an extra roll because he reminded her of her grandson. Cale thought about the man on the table, the blood spreading across the treaty, the way his hand had reached for a blade even as he died. He wasn't supposed to be at the library, Alara continued. He was supposed to be on patrol. But 3 days before the signing, he sent me a message. Just one line. "Be careful who you trust." I didn't understand what it meant. I thought he was just being protective. She was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice was smaller. Then he showed up at my apartment the night before the signing. Told me something was wrong. That there were people on both sides who didn't want the treaty to work. People who'd kill to make sure it failed. He said he'd be at the library during the signing. Watching. Making sure I was safe. Cale heard the crack in her voice. Felt it in his own chest. And now he's gone. And I don't even have his body to bury. The silence stretched between them. Cale wanted to say something. Wanted to offer comfort, reassurance, anything. But he'd spent 15 years learning to shut down emotion, not express it. The words wouldn't come. So instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out one of the last 2 potatoes. Held it out to her in the darkness. She took it. He heard her small laugh, sad and surprised. "You're giving me your food? We share or we don't make it." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "Why do you care if I make it?" It was a fair question. They were enemies, technically. Bound by a treaty neither trusted. Hiding from people who wanted them dead. Stuck together by circumstance and nothing more. Cale thought about it. Really thought about it. "Because you grabbed that map," he said finally. "When your brother was dying on the table, you grabbed that map. Most people would have frozen. Would have screamed or run or just collapsed. You grabbed the one thing that might matter." Alara didn't respond. But he heard her eat the potato, small bites, making it last. Hours passed. Or maybe minutes. Tom didn't work right anymore. Cale must have slept, because he woke to the sound of Alara crying. Not loud. Just small, quiet sobs she was trying to hide. He lay still, not wanting to embarrass her by noticing. But then she spoke into the darkness. "He's dead because of me. Because I was too important. Because someone wanted to send a message. And I don't even know who." Cale sat up. Found her hand in the dark. Held it. "Then we find out." "How?" "We're trapped in an ice house. No food. No weapons. No idea who's hunting us." Cale was quiet for a moment. Then he reached down and pulled something from his boot. Paper, folded small. He pressed it into her hand. She unfolded it in the darkness. Felt the edges. The texture. This is the other half of your map. I've had it since the library. Alara's breath caught. You stole it from me? No. I had my own copy. Different details. Different markings. Compare them. She was silent for a long moment, running her fingers over both pages, feeling for differences. Then, these routes. They don't match. Your map shows northern patrols in areas mine marks as neutral. Exactly. Someone's been lying. Someone on both sides. Alara's voice changed. Sharper. More focused. You knew this before the signing? Kale hesitated. Then, yes. And you signed anyway? I signed because if I didn't, the war would continue. Thousands more dead. I chose the lesser evil. Alara was quiet. When she spoke, her voice was cold. My brother is dead because of the lesser evil. Kale didn't argue. Couldn't argue. She was right. Another long silence. Kale waited for her to pull away. To hate him. To do what anyone sensible would do and stop trusting the enemy soldier who'd just admitted he knew something was wrong and did nothing. Instead, she moved closer. Her shoulder pressed against his in the darkness. We're getting out of here, she said. And then we're finding out who made those maps. And we're making them pay. Kale blinked in the darkness. You trust me? No. But I don't trust anyone else either. And right now, you're all I've got. Dawn came. Or didn't. Kale couldn't tell anymore. But the light under the door changed, and that was enough. He stood up. His legs were stiff, his stomach empty, his head light. But he stood anyway. Alara stood beside him. They looked at the door together. We wait for dark, Kale said. Then we move. Alara nodded. Then she reached into her shirt and pulled out the map. Her brother's blood had dried to a dark brown at the corner. She looked at it for a long moment. I thought he was just being protective, she said quietly. I thought he was worried about his little sister signing a treaty with the enemy. She folded the map carefully and put it back. But he wasn't warning me about you. He was warning me about all of them. Kale looked at her. At the set of her jaw. At the fire in her eyes despite 3 days without food. Tomas sounds like he was a good man. Alara nodded. He was. And he was right. Be careful who you trust. She met his eyes in the dim light. Held his gaze. I'm learning. The light under the door began to fade. Evening coming. Or maybe just clouds passing. But they took it as a sign. Kale moved toward the door. Pressed his ear to the wood. Listened for footsteps, voices, anything. Nothing. He turned back to Alara. Held out his hand. Together? She looked at his hand. Then at his face. Then at the door. And then Alara realized his loyalty to the North was a lie. The words hung in the cold air between them. His loyalty to the North was a lie. Alara stared at Kale in the dim light filtering through the icehouse door. Her hand was still reaching toward his. She let it drop. How long? She asked. Kale's face was unreadable. 5 years. 5 years. She heard her own voice rise. 5 years you've been pretending to be one of them? 5 years of signing orders, enforcing borders, watching people like my brother get hurt. Yes. The simplicity of it broke something open in her chest. All the anger she'd been holding, all the grief, all the fear, it had nowhere to go. He wasn't the enemy. He'd never been the enemy. Who are you really working for? Kale moved closer to the door. Kept his voice low. There's a group. Small. People from both sides who got tired of watching their leaders send children to die for land that didn't matter. We've been meeting in secret for 3 years. Trying to find a way to make real peace. Not just temporary truces that everyone knows will fail. Alara thought about her brother's last message. Be careful who you trust. And Tomas. Did he know? Kale hesitated. It was a small thing, that hesitation, but she caught it. Tomas was supposed to be one of us. Kale said quietly. He was supposed to be at the library to protect you, yes. But also to protect the treaty. To make sure no one on either side sabotaged it before it could take effect. The world tilted slightly. Alara pressed a hand against the cold stone wall to steady herself. My brother was working with you? With us. With the peace faction. He believed real change was possible. He believed enough people on both sides wanted it badly enough to make it happen. Alara closed her eyes, saw Tomas at her apartment the night before the signing. The worry in his eyes. The way he'd hugged her longer than usual when he left. I thought he was just being protective, she whispered. He was. But he was also being hopeful. He thought the signing was the first real step. He didn't know someone had already planned to stop it. The door. They needed to focus on the door. On getting out. On surviving. Alara opened her eyes. Looked at Kale. Saw him differently now. Not an enemy soldier. Just a man. Tired and hungry and scared. Same as her. What now? Kale moved to the door. Pressed his ear against it. Listened. Now we use what we know. Those maps. Yours and mine. They show different patrol routes. That means someone on both sides has been moving troops into neutral territory. Building up forces. Waiting for the treaty to fail so they can blame the other side and restart the war. The attack at the library. The men who took Tomas's body. Part of it. Make it look like Northern soldiers killed a Southern officer during the signing. Give the Southern hardliners an excuse to pull out of the treaty. Give the Northern hardliners an excuse to call the Southerners untrustworthy and resume fighting. Alara's stomach turned. And us? Why didn't they just kill us too? Kale met her eyes. Because we're more useful alive. 2 witnesses. A Northern enforcer and a Southern archivist. We could be found later, tell our story, confirm whatever version of events they want people to believe. Or we could be blamed for the attack ourselves. Either way, we're tools. Not people. The cold in the ice house seemed to deepen. Alara looked at the door, then at the stone walls, then at the crack in the limestone where they'd been getting water. Wait, she said slowly. This place. The ice houses. They're old, right? From before the wars. Kale nodded. 50 years at least. Maybe more. In my archives, I've seen records of this area. Maps from 100 years ago, when the river trade was bigger. The ice houses weren't just storage. They were connected. Tunnels between them, so workers could move ice without going outside. Keep it cold, keep it clean. Kale's eyes sharpened. You remember a specific location? An exit. Alara closed her eyes. Pictured the old maps in her mind. The curling edges. The faded ink. The careful handwriting of archivists long dead. The third ice house. The one farthest upstream. There's a tunnel that runs inland, away from the river. Comes out near the old chapel ruins on the hill. The chapel we passed on the way here? Yes. Kale looked at the door again, then at the back wall of their small prison. That wall. It's limestone, same as the rest. But look, there, near the floor. The pattern changes. Alara followed his gaze. In the dim light, she could just make it out. The stones near the floor were fitted differently. Rougher edges. Less precision. A door, sealed long ago. They moved toward it together. Kale dropped to his knees, ran his fingers along the edges of the stones. Found gaps. Found purchase. Help me. Alara knelt beside him. Together, they pulled at the largest stone. It didn't move at first. 50 years of settling, of pressure and time, held it in place. They pulled harder. Their breath came in white puffs. Their fingers ached with cold. The stone shifted. Just a little. Just enough to feel. They pulled again. This time it moved more, scraping against its neighbors, revealing darkness beyond. Not the solid darkness of a wall. The empty darkness of a space. Kale looked at Alara. There was something new in his eyes. Respect, maybe. Or surprise. You're more than just an archivist. Alara almost smiled. I read a lot of books. They worked faster now, pulling stone after stone, building a pile behind them. The opening grew. By the time it was wide enough to crawl through, both of them were sweating despite the cold. Kale went first. Squeezed through the gap, disappeared into the darkness. A moment later, his voice echoed back. It's a tunnel. Head height. Runs east. Alara followed. The tunnel was narrower than the ice house, just wide enough for one person. The walls were damp, slick with condensation. The air smelled of earth and something else, something old and dry, like the inside of the archives where she'd spent her childhood. They walked for what felt like hours. The tunnel sloped upward, away from the river. Roots broke through the ceiling in places, dangling like fingers. Once, something small skittered away in the darkness ahead of them. Cale didn't speak. Neither did Alara. They just walked. And then, ahead, light. Not the dim gray of the icehouse door. Real light. Late afternoon sun, golden and warm, slanting through an opening. The tunnel ended in a collapse. Not a complete collapse. The ceiling had fallen in at an angle, creating a gap between fallen stones and earth. Through that gap, they could see sky, trees, the broken walls of the old chapel. Cale climbed first, pulled himself up through the gap, emerged into the sunlight, reached back down for Alara. She took his hand, let him pull her out. They stood together in the chapel ruins, blinking in the light. The sun was low in the west. Late afternoon, October 17th. 3 days since the library. 3 days since Tomas died. Below them, hidden by trees, they heard voices. Cale pulled Alara behind a fallen column. They crawled to the edge of the ruins and looked down. The valley below opened onto a clearing. And in that clearing, a camp had been set up. Tents, fires, horses, soldiers moving between them. Northern soldiers, southern soldiers. Together. Alara's breath caught. There. Meeting, Cale whispered. The leaders. Look, she saw them then. 2 men near the largest tent, laughing together over a flask. General Marcus Webb of the Northern Forces. General Thea Chun of the Southern Army. Enemies for 20 years. Now sharing a drink like old friends. It was them, Alara breathed. Both of them. They planned this together. Cale nodded slowly. The attack at the library. Tomas's death. The treaty's failure. All designed to give them an excuse to restart the war. They don't want peace. They want power. Alara's hands clenched into fists. She thought of Tomas. His last message. His last hug. His body. Taken somewhere. Disposed of like garbage so these two could keep fighting. We have to stop them. How? We're 2 people with no weapons and no proof. Alara looked at the camp. At the generals. At the soldiers below who had no idea their leaders were trading their lives for personal gain. Then we get proof. She pulled out the maps. Both of them. Hers and his. The mismatched patrol routes. The evidence of troop movements into neutral territory. Cale looked at the maps. Then at the camp. Then at her. If we go down there, we might not come back. I know. If we run, we could find a real peace faction. Bring help. Tomas didn't run. Cale was quiet for a long moment. Then he nodded. Together? It was the same question he'd asked in the ice house. But now it meant something different. Now it meant everything. Alara took his hand. Together. They moved down the hill, staying low, using trees and rocks for cover. The camp grew closer. The voices grew clearer. General Chun was laughing at something General Webb had said, her head thrown back, her confidence absolute. They didn't see the 2 figures approaching from the chapel ruins. They didn't see Alara stop at the edge of the clearing, pull out the maps one last time, check their position against the terrain. They didn't see Cale reach for the small knife at his belt, the only weapon they had, and grip it tight. Alara looked at Cale. He looked at her. She nodded. He stepped forward, out of the trees, into the clearing. And then everything happened at once. The library smelled different now. 3 weeks had passed since Alara last stood in this room. 3 weeks since glass had exploded inward and her brother's body had landed on the treaty table. 3 weeks since her life had split into before and after. October had turned to November. The rain had turned to frost. And someone had finally boarded up the broken window with fresh pine planks that still smelled of sap when you stood close enough. Alara stood alone at the table. The same table. The same room. The same brass holder where the bone quill had rested. But everything else had changed. The treaty lay before her, all 73 pages, repaired and rebound by hands she didn't know. The bloodstains on the vellum had faded to a faint brown, like old tea spilled on paper. You wouldn't notice them unless you knew where to look. Unless you'd been there. Alara knew where to look. Her finger traced the edge of page 42. The page she'd grabbed as she ran. The page with her brother's blood dried into the corner. Someone had cleaned it carefully, respectfully, but the stain remained. A shadow of what happened. She heard footsteps behind her. Not heavy boots this time. Not the pounding of men hunting. Just footsteps. Steady. Measured. The slight drag of a left foot that hadn't healed quite right. Cale. He stopped beside her. Didn't speak. Just stood there, looking at the treaty the same way she did. Like it was something fragile. Something that had almost broken. 3 weeks ago, they'd walked into that clearing together. 3 weeks ago, they'd faced Generals Webb and Chun with nothing but 2 maps and the truth. Alara still couldn't quite believe it had worked. She remembered the silence when Cale stepped out of the trees. The way every soldier in that clearing had turned, hands going to weapons, ready to attack. And then Alara had stepped out behind him, and the confusion on their faces had been almost comical. A northern enforcer and a southern archivist. Together. Alive. Holding evidence that their leaders had been lying to everyone. General Webb had laughed at first, called them deserters, traitors, ordered his soldiers to arrest them. But the soldiers hadn't moved. That was the moment Alara would never forget. The moment she realized that the peace faction Cale had told her about wasn't just a handful of secret meetings. It was everywhere. In both armies. In both territories. Ordinary soldiers who were tired of fighting, tired of dying, tired of being told that the people on the other side were monsters. One of Webb's own captains had stepped forward, taken the maps from Alara's hands, looked at them for a long moment, then looked at his general with eyes that held no warmth at all. "Sir," he'd said quietly, "I think we need to talk." That was 3 weeks ago. Now, in the library, Cale placed something on the table beside the treaty. A quill. Not the bone quill from before. Not the ceremonial relic of an extinct bird. This was a simple gray feather from a common gull, its shaft whittled to a point, its tip freshly cut. Alara picked it up. It was lighter than she expected. Warmer somehow, though that made no sense. "The old one broke," Cale said. During everything. "I found this on the riverbank this morning. Thought it might work." Alara looked at him. Really looked at him for the first time since they'd come back. He was different. Not just the way he walked, though that limp would probably never fully heal. Something in his eyes had changed. The coldness she'd seen at their first meeting, the careful distance he'd kept from everyone and everything, it was gone. Replaced by something softer. Something that looked almost like hope. "You've been coming here?" she asked. "To the river?" "Every morning. Helps me think." Alara nodded. She understood. The river had become a kind of anchor for her too. The way it kept moving, kept flowing, no matter what happened on its banks. There was something comforting in that. She looked down at the treaty, at the place where their signatures sat side by side. Cale Mason, Alara Vance, written in ink that had nearly been washed away by blood. "We should sign the new pages," she said quietly. "The ones they had to replace." Cale nodded. Didn't move. Alara waited. "I've been thinking," he said finally, "about what happens now. The ceasefire is holding. The investigations are happening. Webb and Chun are in custody. But eventually, someone's going to have to rebuild. Someone's going to have to make this real." Alara looked at him. And I don't know if I'm the right person for that. I've spent 15 years learning to fight, to distrust, to keep everyone at arm's length because caring about people just gives you something to lose." Alara thought about her brother, about the hole his death had left in her chest that she suspected would never fully close. "I know that feeling," she said. Cale met her eyes. "But you don't let it stop you. You lost Tomas, and you kept going. You walked into that clearing with nothing but paper and courage. You trusted me when every sensible bone in your body must have been screaming not to." Alara almost smiled. To be fair, every sensible bone in my body was screaming not to. That did it. Cale's mouth twitched. Just slightly. But it was there. A smile. Small and surprised, like he'd forgotten how. The library door opened. They both turned. A young woman stood there, maybe 19, with a stack of books in her arms and a nervous expression on her face. One of the new archivists, hired to help repair the damage from the attack. "Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't know anyone was." She stopped, recognized them, and her eyes went wide. "You're them. You're the ones who. She trailed off, clearly unsure what to say. Alara smiled at her. Real this time. It's okay. We were just leaving. The young woman nodded quickly and hurried to the far side of the room, pretending to organize shelves, but definitely stealing glances at them when she thought they weren't looking. Kale picked up the gull feather quill, held it out to Alara. You first. She took it, dipped the tip in the small ink pot someone had left on the table, found the fresh page, crisp and clean, waiting for their names. Alara Vance. She wrote it slowly, the way she always did. Each letter deliberate, each stroke meaningful. But this time, her hand didn't tremble. She handed the quill to Kale. He signed his name beneath hers. Kale Mason. His letters were still sharp, still clean. But when he finished, he didn't pull his hand away immediately. His fingers rested on the paper for just a moment, beside her name. Outside, through the gaps in the pine boards, Alara could hear something she hadn't heard in this place before. Laughter. She moved closer to the window, peered through the narrow gap between two planks. The square below was full of people. Market day, she realized. She'd lost track of time so completely that she hadn't even known what day it was. Children ran between the stalls, chasing each other. A group of women stood talking near the bread cellar, their baskets full of vegetables and cloth. An old man sat on a bench, feeding crumbs to the pigeons. And among them, moving through the crowd like they belonged there, she saw soldiers. Northern and Southern. Not on patrol, not on guard. Just walking, talking. One Southern soldier was helping an older woman lift a heavy sack onto her shoulder. A Northern soldier was buying bread from the same cart Alara's brother had written about in his letters. The old woman with the extra rolls. Alara's eyes stung. She blinked rapidly and turned back to the room. Kale was watching her. He'd seen what she saw. It's working, he said quietly. The ceasefire. It's actually working. For now. For now, he agreed. That's all anyone gets. For now. But maybe that's enough. Maybe we just keep building for now until one day we look up and it's been 20 years and no one remembers why they were fighting in the first place. Alara looked at the treaty, at their signatures, at the gray feather quill lying beside it. What will you do, she asked, now that it's over? Kale was quiet for a moment. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out something small, a folded paper. He handed it to her. She opened it. A map, not the border maps from before. A different kind of map. This one showed the library, the river, the icehouses, the chapel ruins. Places marked with small X's and notes in handwriting she didn't recognize. What is this? Places that matter, Kale said. Places I want to remember. Places I want to show someone, if they're willing to see them. Alara looked up at him. His face was carefully neutral, but there was something in his eyes. A question, a hope, a fear. She folded the map carefully and put it in her pocket. I'd like that, she said. To see them. With you. The young archivist across the room pretended very hard to be interested in a book about agricultural history. Kale nodded once. Twice. Then he held out his hand. Not the hand that had grabbed her wrist in the library. Not the hand that had pulled her through the dark. Just his hand. Open. Waiting. Alara took it. His palm was warm against hers. Rough with calluses from years of holding weapons. But gentle too. Gentle in a way she suspected he didn't show many people. They stood like that for a moment. Just two people in a library, holding hands, surrounded by books and history and the smell of rain and pine. Then Alara looked at the treaty one last time. At the bloodstained page. At the fresh signatures. At the gray feather quill that had come from a common bird on the riverbank. The bone quill had come from a bird that couldn't exist anymore. A relic of a world that had died. The gray feather came from a bird that still flew, still lived, still dropped its feathers on riverbanks for people to find. Alara picked up the quill, held it for a moment. Then she rolled up the treaty, not carefully, not formally, just rolled it like it was any ordinary document, and handed it to Kale. He looked surprised. You want me to? Keep it safe. For now. I'll get it back later. He took it, held it against his chest like it was something precious. Together, he asked. It was the same question, the same word. But this time it wasn't about survival. It wasn't about running or hiding or fighting. This time it was about walking out of a library together, into a square full of people, into a world that was slowly, carefully, learning to be different. Alara smiled. Together, they walked toward the door, past the young archivist, who had given up all pretense of reading and was just watching them with wide eyes and a small smile of her own, past the tall shelves filled with books that held the stories of everyone who had come before, out into the November air, cold and sharp and clean. The square was busy with its market day noise, children shouting, merchants calling out their prices, the clink of coins and the smell of hot bread and the sound of laughter from a group of soldiers sharing a bench. Kale's hand found hers again. She didn't pull away. They walked through the crowd together. Two people with matching limps, his from the injury, hers from a deep bruise she'd gotten during their escape that still bothered her when she walked too far. Two people who'd started as enemies and ended as something else entirely. At the edge of the square, near the river, they stopped. The water moved past, gray and steady, carrying leaves and light and the reflection of the sky. October 14th, Alara said quietly. That's when everything changed. Kale nodded. November 7th now. Almost a month. Feels like a lifetime. Feels like yesterday. She leaned against him, just slightly. Just enough to feel his warmth through their coats. What happens now? She asked. Kale was quiet for a long moment. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out the map again. The one with all the places that mattered. He unfolded it and pointed to a spot near the river, a little ways upstream. There's a place here. An old fisherman's hut. I found it while I was recovering. No one's used it in years. But the roof is still good and there's a stove inside. Alara looked at the map, then at the river, then at him. Are you asking me to go to a fisherman's hut with you? Kale's ears went slightly red. I'm asking if you want to see the places that matter. All of them. Starting with that one. If you want. Alara thought about it. About everything that had brought them here. About Tomas, who would probably find this whole situation hilarious. About the treaty, rolled up in Kale's coat, blood-stained and hopeful and real. She took the map from his hands, folded it carefully, put it in her pocket next to her heart. Yes, she said. I want that. They started walking upstream, following the river, leaving the library and the square and the market noise behind. The sun was setting over the water, painting everything gold and orange and pink. The kind of sunset that made you believe anything was possible. Even peace. Even trust. Even love between people who'd been taught their whole lives to hate each other. Alara looked back once. At the library in the distance, its broken window boarded up with fresh pine. At the square full of people who didn't know they were living through history. At the river that kept moving, kept flowing, kept carrying everything forward. Then she turned back to Kale, to the path ahead, to whatever came next. He was watching her, that softness still in his eyes. What? She asked. Nothing. Just, thank you. For trusting me. Alara thought about her brother. About his last message. Be careful who you trust. She'd been careful. She'd been so careful. And in the end, she'd trusted the right person after all. Thank you for being worth trusting, she said. Kale smiled. A real smile this time. The kind that changed his whole face. They kept walking. The river kept flowing. The sun kept setting. And somewhere behind them, in the library, the gray feather quill sat on the table beside the repaired treaty, waiting for the next person who needed to sign their name to something that mattered.